of the journals. As you sit here today with the memory that you have intact, what can you tell us that she wrote that was negative? You did say that you read the journals, right?
I did read the journals.
Argumentative and foundation date and time that he's referring to.
Overruled.
Right? You did say you read the journals, right?
Yes, I did.
Can you tell us that is negative that she wrote in any of those journals?
You're asking me specific comments she made, and I can't tell you specifically what she said because I don't have the journal with me.
Oh, so in order for you to tell us what she wrote in the journal, you have to have it in front of your face so that you can read it, right?
Objection, argumentative.
Sustained. Rephrase.
Well, it seems to be what you're telling me is that your memory is lacking as to what was in those journals. Yes or no?
No.
All right, then give me another example of what you read in those journals that is negative that the defendant said.
She says, she talks about not being productive.
Okay, what else?
She talks about feeling lousy about herself.
Okay.
She talks about not being advanced in PPL the way she'd like to be advanced in PPL. She talks about not having her goals, not forwarding her goals in the way she wants to.
Anything else?
I'm sure there are other things.
But you just can't remember right now, right?
I can't.
And all in all, what you've given us is a pretty positive picture of the defendant, because those kinds of things that you're talking about are really not that major in the grand scheme of things, are they?
They're not that major.
And ma'am, with regard to this issue of how you conduct your work, the way it really works is that you conduct the interviews and then you look at other sources, right?
I do.
And that's what you did in this case, with the exception that you only conducted one interview, right? The defendant's interview, right?
Yes.
And in this case, this roadmap that you gave us, which is Exhibit 558, that is, in a sense, a roadmap, right?
It's a guideline.
It's a guideline, which means we can look at it to guide us to a goal, right?
It is a guideline. It is not a specific roadmap that will take you from here to here.
I'm not asking, I've left the word roadmap behind. I actually used the word guideline. Isn't this a guideline that will take us to a certain decision or opinion by you? Isn't this in part, well, isn't this a guideline that you used?
It is a guideline.
And this is a guideline that you created, right?
Yes, it is.
So that you can change it whenever you want, right?
I have changed it.
Right. So the answer is, this is your guideline and you can change it whenever you want, right?
Yes.
And in fact, with regard to using this guideline, isn't it true that you really don't even have to talk to any of the parties that are involved in order for you to reach your opinion?
I don't use a guideline that way, Mr. Martinez.
Well, are you familiar, back in 2010, are you familiar putting on a seminar and indicating that Snow White was a battered woman? Do you remember talking about that?
Objection, relevance.
Overruled.
Do you remember that, yes or no?
No, that's, if you would like to show the entire YouTube video, I would be happy for anybody to see that, because I'm not talking, the title is Snow White a Battered Woman because it was catchy.
Right. So it does say is Snow White a battered woman, right? That is the title of it, correct?
It is.
And in fact, you gave this presentation, if you will, in Las Vegas back in 2010, right?
I've given it more than once.
In 2010, isn't it true that you gave this presentation in Las Vegas?
I gave a short form of it.
Yes or no?
I gave a short form of it, yes, I did.
Did I ask you whether it was a long, medium, or short form?
Well, there are different versions of it, Mr. Martinez.
I'm asking you whether or not you gave this presentation, yes or no? I'm not asking about the
I
length.
gave a presentation in Las Vegas, yes, I did.
Isn't it true that you also gave that presentation in Los Angeles, again in 2010?
An altered version.
But you did give this presentation involving Snow White and whether or not she was a battered woman in Los Angeles, right?
Yes,
And one of the items that you used with regard to that in trying to determine whether or not an individual is a battered person, you look at 558. That's a guideline that you use, right?
I did not use that at all in any of the speaking engagements, Mr.
Well,
Martinez.
I'm not asking if you used it in the speaking engagements. In this case, for example, you talked about family of origin issues. Do you see that up there?
Yes,
And one of the things that you told us, well, you looked at the family origin of Mr. Alexander. Didn't you tell us that?
yes.
Well, if we take a look to follow up on your Snow White issue that you presented, isn't it true that she had family of origin issues, didn't she?
The family of origin issues we're talking about here, Mr. Martinez, are the family of origin issues for the perpetrator.
Okay. So, in other words, in this case, you see Mr. Alexander as the perpetrator. You don't see him as the victim.
No.
And so it's...
Well, I am looking at domestic violence. And in regard to domestic violence, I am seeing Mr. Alexander as the perpetrator. Yes.
And one of the things that we know about your presentation also is that, and Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is a fairy tale by the Brothers Grimm, right?
Yes.
And in it, we have an individual, that's the king, right, who is married and has a kid, and they name her Snow White, right? Yes or no?
I'm not using the Brothers Grimm version. I'm using the Walt Disney cartoon. I just want to make that clear.
So there's different, all right? But it is true, though, that Snow White had a father, right?
Yes, she did.
And the father was the king, right?
Yes.
And it ends up that Snow White's mother ends up dying, right?
Yes.
And what ends up happening is that he remarries, right?
Yes.
And what ends up happening when he remarries is that he has somebody who is less than honorable, if you will, or savory with regard to her view of Snow White, correct?
Yes.
And so what happens during that situation is that there is a problem because this woman, the queen, begins to, if you will, abuse or be less than nice to Snow White, right?
Yes.
So what we have then is a situation where we have a father who has failed to protect, right? If we're looking at it from this global perspective, right?
Yes.
And so then, if we look at it that way, Snow White is sort of being, and I use the term loosely, abused. Not in the technical sense, but she's not being treated correctly, right?
She's being abused as a child, right?
That's correct. And one of the things that happens after that is that the father sends her away, correct? She goes into the forest, right?
Objection for relevance, going this far into the Snow White story?
Overruled.
Right?
She goes into the woods, correct.
And in fact, when she's out in the woods, there's neglect by the father, right?
Yes.
So, for example, in this particular case, one of the things that you used in your evaluation was that the defendant, according to you, suffered some abuse as a kid, right?
Yes.
According to you, the wicked stepmother in her circumstance is her mother, right?
I didn't say that.
No, I'm the one that's asking the question. Isn't that true?
I don't equate her mother with a wicked stepmother.
Well, her mother, according to what you found out, hit her with a spoon, right?
Right.
And according to what we know is she allowed her father to hit her also, right?
Yes, she did.
And her father hit her, and at one point, you know, some of this. What do you know about what her father did to her in terms of any abuse that there may be here?
There was one incident where he pushed her and she hit a piece of furniture and lost consciousness.
And the mother was present, right?
I'm not certain if the mother was present, Mr.
Wouldn't that be
Martinez.
important to know?
Not necessarily, because there were other incidents.
Pardon?
There were other incidents. I'm not evaluating whether or not Ms. Arias is a battered child, Mr. Martinez. I was looking at the issues of domestic violence.
Well, ma'am, you're talking about abuse, aren't you?
I'm
Right?
talking about domestic violence between two adult intimates.
And one of the things that you just told me that you did was that you looked at the background of the defendant. Didn't you just tell me that?
I did.
And you know about this abuse at the hands of her mother, right?
Yes.
And one of the things that happens, and we've talked about Snow White being sent out in the forest, one of the things that happens to the defendant, you're aware, is that according to what you know, isn't it true that before this she was the age of majority, she was, if you will, also sent out into the woods to go live with somebody else, right?
She was not sent out. She chose to leave.
So she left. In other words, she chose to leave. Why? Why do you believe that she chose to leave?
Objection, relevant speculation. Very tough.
Overruled.
Go ahead. Why did she choose to leave?
She chose to leave because she felt abused and because she felt controlled.
By her parents, right?
Yes.
And she moved in with somebody by the name of what? What was his name?
Bobby Wattis.
And she lived in what can be best described as less than ideal circumstances, right?
Correct.
And the same thing with Snow White, right? She lived in a situation with less than ideal circumstances, right?
She lived with the seven dwarfs, and according to the Disney version, she was pretty happy.
Well, she lived in a shack, right?
I thought it was a cute little cottage, Mr. Martinez.
All right. But there's seven dwarfs that she's living with, right? No one of her own age is there, right?
I don't know the age of the dwarfs.
Well,
I don't. I'm sorry, but I don't.
What I'm saying to you is it your opinion that there were other little kids that would play in the playground with her when she was living with the seven dwarfs?
Objection, relevance. Argumentative.
Overruled. You may continue.
Would you repeat the question, please?
Is it your understanding that there were other little kids to play with Snow White out near the shack?
Near the cottage? No.
In fact, she was just there cooking and cleaning, right?
Well, she was talking to the birds and singing with the animals.
And cooking and cleaning for the dwarfs, right?
Correct.
Isn't that sort of what you know about the defendant and Bobby Juarez, right?
I don't know that Jodi Arias was cooking and cleaning for Bobby Wattis.
Do you know if he was working?
He was not working.
Do you know who was providing the money to buy the food?
They were living with his family.
Right, but do you know whether or not the defendant was working?
She was working.
Do you know whether or not she indicated on the stand that she was the one that bought all the food?
I've not been privy to what she said on the stand, Mr. Martinez.
Did you discuss it with her?
That she bought food and
Sure.
brought food into the house? Yes, she did.
And then with regard to Snow White, one of the things that we know is that something bad happens to her, right? The incident with the apple, right?
Yes.
Somebody comes and harms her, right?
Yes.
And we can take it different ways, but do you know any incident involving her and Bobby Juarez?
Yes.
What is the incident that you know about?
I know about a time that he choked her. I know that he, according to Mr. McCartney, verbally abused her.
So with regard to the choking, that's a violent act, correct?
Correct.
Just like this issue involving the apple is a violent act, right?
Correct.
And with regard to Snow White, we know that she ends up going unconscious, as we would talk about it in this day and age, right?
Correct.
And basically what's going on with her is that she's waiting around, right? For Prince Charming, right? Or somebody, right?
She's waiting around?
Well, she's not going anywhere, right?
When she's unconscious?
Right.
Well, when she's unconscious, she's lying around unconscious.
Right. And then we have the kiss, or whatever happens, and Snow White awakens, right?
Correct.
And she starts to live with Prince Charming, right?
Yes.
And if we start talking about this issue involving the balance of power, in that particular situation, Snow White has no power, right?
Objection, relevance.
Overruled.
Right?
Well, she's a queen. I'm not sure what kind of power she has.
The king has the power, doesn't he?
Objection, Foundation.